She was just a little girl, shivering in the storm, chased from her home by a heartless stepmother, clutching a small phone as her only lifeline. Her voice trembled as she called, "Daddy, I'm scared." From the shadows of an abandoned hospital, a retired K-9 emerged, standing guard over her like an angel with fur. What followed was a race through the night, a father fighting against time, a loyal dog refusing to back down, and a child praying for someone to come back for her. This story will grip your heart and remind you that love, courage, and faith can light even the darkest places. Where are you listening from today? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below the video. Thank you. Amen. Havenbrook, Montana, was the kind of town where the mountains stood like silent guardians, and the streets seemed to remember every footstep they had ever carried. On most days, the air smelled faintly of pine and the distant river, but today the scent was washed away by relentless rain. The storm had rolled in fast, hammering the rooftops with cold sheets of water, turning the cracked sidewalks into rivers of muddy runoff. Street lamps glowed dim in the gray afternoon, their halos blurred by the downpour. In the heart of this dreary weather stood a little girl, her small frame trembling, her knuckles white around a phone pressed to her ear. Sophie Lane, just 6 years old, looked far too small against the sprawling decay of the old Oak Ridge Hospital behind her. Her long, chestnut brown hair hung in wet ropes over her face, plastered to her tear-streaked cheeks. She wore a faded purple dress, the fabric torn at the hem and across one shoulder, revealing the pale skin beneath. Dirt and rainwater streaked her arms and legs, and her bare knees were scraped, the dried blood washed away into pink rivulets by the rain. Her large hazel eyes, usually bright with curiosity, were wide with fear now, darting to the shadows in the hospital doorway behind her. She was shivering, but not entirely from the cold. Sophie was the kind of child who, under normal circumstances, brimmed with imagination and warmth. But in this moment, she was just a frightened little girl who had been told she didn't belong in her own home. She raised the phone closer to her lips, her voice trembling. "Daddy?" Far away, hundreds of miles across the country, Mark Lane was in the mess hall of Fort Ralston, an army base tucked deep in the rolling plains. Mark was 34, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean build of a man who had spent more than a decade in military service. His skin was sun-worn and lined at the edges from years in the field. His short, dark hair was beginning to show the first hints of gray near the temples. The army had carved discipline into his posture, but there was still a gentleness in his steel-blue eyes, especially when he spoke to his daughter. He had the calm, deliberate voice of a man used to diffusing tense situations. But Sophie's call struck through his composure like lightning. "Hey, baby girl," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. "What's going on?" Sophie's voice cracked, the words spilling out between sobs. "Mommy," she paused, corrected herself. "Melissa, she told me to leave. She said, I'm a problem. She locked the door." Melissa Mark's second wife, Sophie's stepmother, was a woman whose sharp beauty had once drawn Mark in during a lonely chapter of his life. She was in her early 30s, tall and slim, with sleek blonde hair that framed a face of high cheekbones and cold green eyes. To neighbors, she could seem charming in short bursts, the kind of charm that wore like perfume applied for special occasions. But behind closed doors, her patience was razor thin, especially toward Sophie. Melissa had been raised in a household where affection was a scarce currency, and where appearances were valued above kindness. She carried those values like invisible luggage, heavy and unyielding. To her, Sophie was a reminder of Mark's first marriage, a living thread to a life Melissa could never fully control. Mark's grip tightened around the phone, his jaw set. "Where are you now?" Sophie sniffled, glancing behind her toward the dark, yawning entrance of the Oak Ridge Hospital. The building had been abandoned for over 20 years after a fire gutted one of its wings. Its paint peeled in great curling sheets, and the wooden door sagged on its rusted hinges. Broken windows grinned from the second floor, jagged teeth of glass catching what little light filtered through the rain. The townsfolk whispered that Oak Ridge was haunted, but Sophie hadn't come here for ghost stories. She had simply wandered with nowhere else to go. "I'm outside the hospital," she said, her voice so small Mark had to strain to hear over the static of the line and the patter of rain. "It's cold, Daddy. I don't know where to go." Mark stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. The low murmur of soldiers around him faded as his focus tunneled. "Listen to me," he said firmly but gently. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't go inside. I'm coming home. Keep talking to me, sweetheart." The mess hall doors banged open as he strode out into the corridor, already planning how to get leave on such short notice. His mind was a storm, half in Havenbrook with his daughter, half in the reality of the Army's red tape. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to board the next flight, to tear down the miles between them. Meanwhile, Sophie clutched the phone tighter, the rain soaking the fabric of her dress until it clung to her small frame. Her shoes squelched in puddles forming at her feet. She could hear her father's voice, steady and warm despite the distance, and it anchored her like a rope in a flood. Behind her, the darkness inside Oakridge seemed to shift. A sound low, heavy echoed from the hallway just beyond the broken door. Sophie's eyes widened, her breath catching. From the gloom emerged a shape, four-legged and solid. It stepped forward, and the rain light revealed a large German shepherd. Its coat was a rich blend of black and tan, matted slightly from the weather. Deep amber eyes locked onto Sophie's, sharp yet not unfriendly. The dog's ears were erect, its tail held in a posture of alertness. It moved with the measured, fluid gait of an animal trained to assess threats before acting. This was Max, a retired K-9 once enlisted in the Havenbrook Police Department's unit. 7 years old, his muzzle was just beginning to gray. Max had spent years chasing suspects, sniffing out danger and standing between harm and the innocent. His last handler had been an older officer who'd passed away unexpectedly, and since then Max had roamed the outskirts of town, living on instinct and the occasional scraps offered by sympathetic locals. Loyal by nature but cautious with strangers, Max was not the kind of dog to approach anyone without reason. Yet something about the little girl in the rain drew him forward. Sophie froze as Max stopped a few feet away, his head slightly lowered, his gaze fixed on her. The dog's presence was commanding, but his eyes softened just enough to ease the tight knot in her chest. Mark's voice crackled through the phone. "Sophie? What's happening?" There's a dog, Daddy," she whispered. Max took another slow step, sniffed the air between them, then circled her once before planting himself squarely between Sophie and the open hospital door, as if claiming the role of guardian without a word spoken. The rain poured over both of them, pooling around Max's paws. But he didn't flinch. Mark's breath caught at the sound of the distant barking, sharp, controlled, the kind of bark that spoke of training and purpose. "Stay with the dog, Sophie, do you hear me? Stay with him." Sophie nodded instinctively, even though her father couldn't see her. She reached out a tentative hand toward Max, who allowed her to touch the thick, rain-slick fur along his neck. He stayed rooted, eyes still scanning the shadows behind them as if daring anything inside the hospital to take a step closer. Mark's voice was firmer now. "I'm coming home, baby girl. You stay with him. I won't let anything happen to you." Sophie's lip trembled, but her voice was steadier than before. "Okay." "I love you, Daddy." "I love you more," Mark said, his tone breaking just slightly before he composed himself again. The rain drummed on, the sky heavy and low. Sophie stood in the shelter of Max's watchful stance, the phone still warm in her small hand, listening to the steady hum of her father's presence on the line. Behind them, the hollow shell of Oakridge seemed to sigh under the storm, its secrets held for another day. But for now, Sophie was not alone. Rain still fell in heavy, unbroken sheets over Havenbrook, turning the sidewalks into dark mirrors of water and making the street lamps shimmer like blurred stars in the mist. Sophie Lane stood on the cracked pavement outside the yawning entrance of Oakridge Hospital, the abandoned building looming behind her like a giant frozen in time. Beside her, Max, the large German shepherd, stood firm, his thick black and tan coat slick with rain, amber eyes locked toward the darkness inside as though daring anything to come out. His ears flicked at every sound, and his stance carried the unmistakable stillness of a protector ready to spring into action. Sophie's fingers curled into the damp fur at his neck. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and though she was still trembling, it was less from fear and more from the chill of the storm. Max had not moved away since approaching her. Instead, he had circled once, sniffed her cautiously, and planted himself in the exact spot that would shield her from the hospital's open doorway. On the other end of the phone, Mark Lane was listening intently. The barking he had heard moments before, sharp, controlled, purposeful, had stirred something deep in his memory. In the military, he had worked alongside K-9 units, watching German shepherds like this charge into danger with fearless precision. That bark was not the aimless cry of a stray, it was the voice of a trained guardian. Mark paced across the dim hallway of Fort Ralston's administrative wing, boots striking the tile with the rhythm of urgency. He pushed open a door labeled Captain J. Holloway, the hinges protesting in the quiet. Captain James Holloway was in his early 50s, with the kind of broad-shouldered frame that looked carved from years of lifting sandbags and wearing body armor. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked heavily with silver and cropped close to his scalp. His deep-set brown eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too many of his soldiers not come home. Holloway had a reputation for fairness, but also for holding the line when it came to regulations. He was a man who respected rules because they were the bones that kept chaos from collapsing the whole body of service. Mark saluted quickly, then stepped forward. "Sir, I need emergency leave. My daughter's in danger, alone." Holloway leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his chest. "You've got orders, Sergeant. We're in pre-deployment readiness, unless it's life or death." "It is," Mark cut in, his voice sharper than intended. He forced himself to breathe before continuing. "She's 6. Her stepmother threw her out. She's outside an abandoned building in the middle of a storm, and—" He hesitated, glancing at the phone still in his hand. "There's a dog with her, a trained one. I think it's a K-9. That means she's caught someone's attention and not necessarily the right kind." Holloway's gaze narrowed. "You're asking me to pull you off base with no notice, Lane. You know the process. Command won't like it." "Command doesn't have a little girl standing in the rain, sir." There was a long pause. Holloway sighed heavily and reached for a stack of leave request forms, flipping through them with deliberate slowness. "I'll escalate it. No promises. Sit tight until you hear from me." Mark's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, I'm not sitting tight. If this doesn't get approved in the next hour, I'm walking off this base and accepting whatever comes after." Holloway's eyes held his for a long moment. "That's not a smart threat to make, Sergeant." But there was a flicker of something else there understanding. He set the forms aside. "Go. I'll cover as much as I can, but you didn't hear that from me." Back in Havenbrook, Sophie was beginning to feel the cold seep deep into her bones. She tugged at the wet fabric of her dress, shivering violently. Max shifted closer, his body heat radiating against her side. He looked up at her once, then back at the hospital, as if reminding her that his watch wasn't over. From the side street came the splash of tires through a puddle. Sophie's head snapped up in alarm, but Max stayed still, ears angled toward the sound without moving his stance. A moment later, a tall woman in a raincoat appeared from around the corner, carrying a paper grocery bag now sagging with water. Martha Keene, mid-60s, with wiry gray hair tucked beneath a wool cap, was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business but often used that knowledge to quietly help. Her face was thin, lined deeply, her eyes a soft hazel that still carried a spark of mischief despite the years. She had grown up in Havenbrook, married young, and spent decades managing the town's small library before it closed 5 years ago. Since then, she'd been a fixture in the neighborhood, keeping an eye on the children and the elderly alike. "Sophie?" she called over the rain, her voice cutting through the storm. "What on earth are you doing out here?" Sophie hesitated, glancing at Max, then back to Martha. "Melissa, she told me to leave." Martha's expression hardened at the mention of Melissa. She stepped closer, but Max took a single step forward, placing himself subtly between Sophie and the newcomer. "It's okay, boy," Martha said softly, crouching a little. "I'm a friend." Max didn't growl, but his gaze stayed locked on her until Sophie's small hand touched his shoulder. "It's okay," Sophie whispered, and Max eased back just enough to let Martha approach. Martha reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from Sophie's face. "Come on, you'll freeze out here." She glanced at the hospital's shadowed doorway. "And this is no place for you, especially not tonight." Sophie looked down at Max. "He was here first. He's keeping me safe." Martha's eyes softened, her voice quiet. "Then he can come too." They took shelter under the narrow awning of the corner store, the rain still pouring just feet away. Martha set her bag down, pulling out a knitted scarf and wrapping it gently around Sophie's shoulders. Max lay beside them, still positioned so he could watch the street and the hospital entrance at the same time. On the phone, Mark listened to the shift in Sophie's breathing, the slight steadiness returning to her voice as she explained to him who Martha was. He felt a rush of relief, but also urgency. "Stay with her until I get there," he told Sophie. Martha's voice came faintly through the receiver. "You just get here fast, Mark, and bring a towel this poor thing's soaked through." Mark smiled grimly despite the tension. "I'm already on my way." By the time Martha led Sophie and Max back toward her small brick house, the wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches along the street. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. A thick quilt waited on the couch, and Max settled on the rug as though he'd known the place for years. Sophie sank into the couch, clutching the quilt, her eyes heavy but still flicking toward the window as though the storm outside might yet find its way in. Far away, Mark was already booking his ticket home, his mind a map of every mile between him and Havenbrook. Holloway's unofficial blessing gave him a slim window, but he knew the real race was against whatever had driven Sophie to that hospital's doorstep in the first place. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of that German shepherd standing guard in the rain kept returning, pulling at memories he hadn't revisited in years. The rain over Havenbrook hadn't slowed. If anything, the storm had grown heavier, its steady roar muting the rest of the world into a gray, trembling blur. Inside Martha Keene's small brick house, the lights glowed warm against the cold. Sophie Lane sat wrapped in a quilt on the couch, Max lying stretched out at her feet, his head resting across his front paws but his amber eyes still open, watching the window. Every so often his ears twitched toward the sound of rain pelting the glass, as if he sensed the storm carried more than just water. Far away, Mark Lane had left Fort Ralston under the thin cover of Captain Holloway's "Look the Other Way" blessing. Now he was in the dim concourse of Billings Logan International Airport, duffel slung over one shoulder, waiting to board a civilian flight east. He hated flying commercial in uniform. It made him feel like a target for small talk and strangers' questions. But tonight, no one seemed inclined to chat. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the look in his eyes, the one that said his mind was 1,000 miles ahead. At a corner table near the gate, Sergio Alvarez tapped on a laptop, his back to the wall. Sergio was Mark's oldest friend in the service, 36, with a sturdy build and warm olive skin. His black hair was cropped close, a neatly trimmed goatee framing a mouth that always seemed on the verge of a smirk. He had grown up in the South Bronx, navigating a childhood of tight budgets and tougher streets, which left him with a talent for finding unconventional solutions. Where Mark was disciplined and by the book, Sergio was a master of bending rules just enough to get results. He glanced up as Mark approached. "Everything's filed. I used the minor in imminent danger clause child safety protocol 3B. They can't ignore it without looking like villains." Mark slid into the chair opposite him. "That'll buy me time, but not much. I still need to get to Havenbrook before anything else happens." Sergio nodded, his expression more serious now. "You'll make it. Just keep me posted. And Mark, if there's more to this than just a family argument, be ready." Back in Havenbrook, the warmth of Martha's living room wasn't enough to quiet Sophie's restlessness. She kept glancing at Max, who would occasionally lift his head and look toward the front door. It was as if the dog sensed a call she couldn't hear. Eventually, she set down the empty mug of cocoa Martha had given her and whispered, "Max, do you want to go outside?" The German shepherd stood, shook out his fur, and moved to the door without a sound. Sophie followed, careful not to wake Martha, who had dozed off in an armchair. Outside, the cold rain hit her like a wall, but Max moved with purpose, leading her back toward the looming silhouette of Oak Ridge Hospital. Oak Ridge was even more menacing up close at night. The upper floors were lost in shadow, the peeling paint and sagging shutters made worse by the streaks of rainwater down its face. The front doors hung slightly ajar, creaking whenever the wind pushed through. Sophie hesitated at the threshold, clutching her small phone in one hand, but Max padded forward into the darkness without fear. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and something sharper old disinfectant, its bite dulled by decades but still faintly present. Broken tiles crunched under Sophie's sneakers. The beam of a flickering overhead light in the lobby cast long shadows across the floor, revealing toppled wheelchairs and gurneys left to rust. Wind howled through shattered windows, carrying with it the hollow moan of the storm. Max's paws made soft thuds on the cracked linoleum as he moved deeper into the hospital. Sophie stayed close behind, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence between gusts of wind. Somewhere above, a piece of metal clattered against the floor. She froze. From a side corridor, the sound of footsteps emerged, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to make the boards beneath them groan. Max's body went rigid, tail low, ears forward. Sophie's grip tightened on her phone. A figure stepped into the dim light. A man in his late 40s, tall but wiry, with a lean face shadowed by days-old stubble. His clothes were mismatched, a worn army green jacket, torn jeans, and scuffed work boots. His hair was a muddy brown streaked with gray, hanging in uneven tufts as if cut with a pocket knife. This was Earl Denton, known in whispers around Havenbrook as someone who lived on the fringes, half rumor, half warning. He had once worked in construction until an accident on a job site left him with a limp and a simmering bitterness toward the world. Since then, Earl had made a living through scavenging and petty theft, using abandoned places like Oak Ridge as temporary caches for stolen goods. He eyed Sophie with a predator's patience, his gaze flicking from her soaked dress to the small phone in her hand. "That's a nice piece of tech you've got there, kid," he said, his voice rough from cigarettes and disuse. Sophie stepped back instinctively, but Max shifted forward, placing himself directly between her and Earl. The German shepherd let out a deep, warning growl, the kind that vibrated in the chest. Earl smirked, unfazed, at least outwardly. "Easy there, mutt. I'm not here to hurt anyone," Earl said, though his eyes lingered on the phone again. "But you don't belong here. This place isn't safe." Sophie swallowed hard. "I'm waiting for my dad." Earl's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you are." He took a step closer, and Max responded with a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. Meanwhile, high above the Midwest, Mark's plane cut through turbulence. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for descent into a connecting airport. Mark stared out the rain-speckled window, his mind running scenarios. He didn't like coincidences, and Sophie's being near Oak Ridge, with a trained K-9 appearing out of nowhere, felt too pointed to dismiss. Sergio's warning replayed in his head. Back in the hospital, Sophie's fear sharpened as Earl shifted his stance. Max stayed rooted, his body angled just enough to shield her completely. Sophie's thumb hovered over the call button on her phone, ready to reconnect with her father, but she knew the reception here was patchy. Earl sighed as though disappointed. "Look, I'll make it simple. Hand me the phone, and I'll let you and your dog walk out of here." Sophie shook her head, voice small but firm. "No." That one word seemed to amuse him, but the sound was cut short by another noise, one that neither Sophie nor Earl had made. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, something metallic scraped across the floor. Earl's head jerked toward the sound, his expression tightening. He muttered something under his breath and backed away a few steps. Max took the opportunity to usher Sophie toward the entrance, his body pushing gently against her legs until she moved. They emerged into the rain once more, the cold air somehow cleaner than the stale breath of the hospital. As they hurried back toward Martha's, Sophie glanced over her shoulder. Earl was still in the doorway watching them, his face unreadable in the storm's shadow. The wind had shifted since Sophie and Max had left the hospital earlier. Now, as the night deepened, it blew colder, harder, driving the rain sideways in sharp needles. The streets of Havenbrook glistened under the sporadic flicker of faulty street lamps, and Oak Ridge Hospital stood like a blackened tooth against the skyline. Sophie hadn't meant to come back. Martha had been resting, and she'd told herself she would only peek from a distance, maybe see if Earl Denton was still lurking. But Max, restless and on edge, had tugged her toward the hospital's perimeter again, his amber eyes fixed with a tension she didn't understand. Inside, Oak Ridge was darker than before. The faint light from earlier had died completely, leaving the corridors to be illuminated only by thin silver beams from the moon breaking through cracked windows. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop loud in the stillness. Sophie's small sneakers squeaked on the slick floor, the sound almost deafening to her ears. From the shadows, a low voice called out, "Back again, little one?" Earl Denton stepped forward from a side hallway, the flicker of a flashlight in his hand casting harsh angles across his gaunt face. His green army jacket was zipped up now, collar turned high, but his limp was more pronounced, his right boot dragging just slightly with each step. His eyes narrow, calculating glinted when they caught the phone in Sophie's hand. "I was just wondering who'd be foolish enough to poke around here twice in one night," he said with a thin smile. "Thought maybe you came back to talk." Max's response was instant, a deep, guttural growl that rolled through the hallway. The fur along his shoulders bristled and his stance shifted forward, protective and unyielding. Earl paused but didn't back away. "No need for the hero act, Mutt. I just want to make sure the girl gets home safe." His tone carried false warmth, the kind people used when they wanted to slip past someone's guard. Sophie's stomach knotted. Every instinct screamed that he was lying. She clutched the phone tighter and stepped back. "We're leaving." Earl tilted his head, taking another step forward. "Not before you let me hold that phone for a minute. I can make sure it gets charged for you." Max barked sharply, the sound echoing like a warning shot. Sophie spun and ran, her feet pounding against the uneven linoleum, Max close behind. She knew the layout of the hospital only vaguely from the earlier visit, long corridors, stairwells at either end, but panic made the turns confusing. She darted toward the nearest set of stairs, their rusted metal rails glistening with condensation. The staircase was narrow and steep, and halfway up, part of the steps had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged gap to the landing above. Sophie scrambled up the side, using the railing to swing herself over the missing steps, Max leaping behind her with effortless precision. Earl's heavier frame hit the stairs seconds later, the clang of his boots reverberating in the stairwell. "You're just making this harder on yourself," Earl's voice echoed after them, a mix of irritation and excitement. They burst onto the second floor, the air cooler here, with more windows broken open to the storm. The rain sprayed inside in thin sheets, and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Sophie's breath came in ragged bursts. Max stayed glued to her side, his ears flicking constantly, his gaze cutting between her and the dark spaces ahead. She turned a corner sharply and skidded to a halt. The hallway was a dead end. The floor here had partially caved, and boards had been nailed haphazardly across it, blocking any safe passage. The only light came from a single moonbeam spilling through a missing window pane, throwing long shadows that danced with every gust of wind. Earl's footsteps grew louder, the flashlight beam bobbing closer. His shadow appeared first on the wall, then he stepped into view, his breath heavy but his smile unshaken. Nowhere else to go. Sophie's fingers shook as she lifted the phone. "Dad!" she shouted into it, voice breaking. "I'm scared!" On the other end, Mark's voice cracked with alarm. "Sophie, where are you?" But Earl lunged forward, his hand shooting toward the phone. Max moved faster. With a sudden, explosive motion, he lunged, jaws clamping down hard on Earl's forearm. Earl cried out in pain, stumbling back, his flashlight clattering to the floor and spinning wildly. The light caught a glimpse of Max's teeth bared in warning before the dog released his grip just enough to shove Earl backward. "Get out, Sophie!" Mark's voice boomed from the tiny speaker, barely audible over the chaos. Sophie spotted it, a narrow maintenance door half hidden behind a torn curtain of plastic sheeting. She darted toward it, Max pulling away from Earl just long enough to follow. The door was stuck at first, the wood swollen from years of damp, but Sophie shoved with all her weight, the hinges groaning before giving way. Beyond the door was a narrow crawl space, lined with pipes and smelling of mildew. Sophie squeezed through, Max right behind her, his warm body a reassurance against the cold metal around them. The space opened into the hospital's backyard, an overgrown patch of cracked asphalt, weeds pushing through every seam. The storm hit them in full force again, soaking them instantly, but the open air felt like freedom. Sophie didn't stop running until they had crossed the yard and slipped between two sagging sections of chain-link fence. Behind them, the hospital loomed, silent but watching, its dark windows like eyes that had seen too much. Max shook himself violently, spraying water in all directions, then pressed close to Sophie's side, guiding her toward the faint glow of a street lamp down the block. She clutched the phone again, breathless but alive. "We're okay, Daddy," she whispered into it, though her voice was still shaking. Mark's reply came after a pause, heavy with relief and urgency. "Stay somewhere safe. I'm almost there." The rain over Havenbrook had turned from a steady curtain into a wild, thrashing deluge by the time Mark Lane's rental jeep rolled past the faded "Welcome to Havenbrook" sign. The wipers fought to clear the windshield, but the water came faster than they could push it away, and the wind howled like a living thing. The headlights carved pale tunnels through the dark, revealing glimpses of empty streets and shuttered storefronts. Mark's phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with a call from an unknown number. He snatched it up without hesitation. "Sergeant Lane?" The voice was deep and steady, belonging to Sheriff Walter Briggs, a man in his late 50s with the slow, deliberate drawl of someone who thought before he spoke. Briggs had served Havenbrook for over 30 years, starting as a deputy in his 20s. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with weathered skin and a salt and pepper beard cropped close. His eyes, sharp blue under heavy brows, were the kind that seemed to see more than you said. "We just got a call from a local about a little girl and a big dog seen near Oak Ridge. Sound like your daughter?" Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. "Yes, sir, that's her. Where exactly?" "Back lot of the hospital," Briggs replied. "A storm like this, they won't last long out there. I've got a unit circling from the west side. You'll be closer coming in from East Harbor Road. Watch for debris, half the streets blocked by downed branches." Mark gave a curt acknowledgement and pressed harder on the gas, the Jeep fishtailing slightly as it hit a patch of standing water. Meanwhile, out in the overgrown rear lot of Oak Ridge Hospital, Sophie and Max were moving as fast as the mud-slick ground allowed. Her soaked purple dress clung to her legs, making it harder to run, and every breath came sharp and shallow. Max stayed half a stride ahead, glancing back often, his amber eyes flashing in the dim light whenever lightning split the sky. He was panting hard, rain streaming down the fur along his black saddle and tan legs, but his posture stayed alert, scanning for threats. In the far distance, Earl Denton hadn't given up entirely. Though the pain from Max's bite slowed him, he lingered at the edge of the hospital yard, watching through the rain like a hunter who'd been forced to retreat. His eyes tracked them until they disappeared into the dark. Back inside the Jeep, Mark's chest felt tight, the kind of tightness that wasn't from fear alone. It was the taut pull of urgency and the weight of every mile he'd been away. He turned onto the cracked asphalt drive leading to the hospital, headlights sweeping across the hulking silhouette of the building. The place looked even worse than he'd remembered from the outside, its windows like empty sockets staring down at him. Then he saw movement, small, quick-cutting across the far end of the yard. A girl's shape, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning, followed closely by the bounding form of a dog. "Hang on, Sophie," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. He swung the Jeep toward them, the beams from his headlights flaring bright in the sheets of rain. Sophie flinched at first, shielding her eyes, but then froze as the vehicle rolled closer. She recognized that tall silhouette behind the wheel even through the blur of water. "Daddy!" Mark slammed the Jeep into park and was out the door in seconds, boots splashing through ankle-deep puddles. The wind tore at his jacket, but he didn't slow until his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him so tightly she could barely breathe. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs mingling with the storm. "You're safe now," he said into her hair, his voice low and fierce. "I've got you. I'm here." Max stood beside them, pressed close against Sophie's side, his gaze sweeping the shadows around the hospital. The deep growl rumbling in his chest said plainly that he didn't trust the storm to be the only danger here. From behind them came the crunch of tires on wet gravel. Sheriff Briggs's SUV pulled up, its red and blue lights strobing faintly against the rain. Briggs stepped out, his heavy-duty raincoat flapping in the wind. "Mark Lane," he called. Mark turned, one hand still on Sophie's shoulder. "Yes, thank you for the call." Briggs gave a nod, his gaze shifting to Sophie and then to Max. "That's a good dog you've got there. Looks like he's been working overtime." "He saved her," Mark said simply. Briggs' eyes softened for a moment, but his tone stayed professional. "Let's get you all out of this weather. I'll take your statement back at the station, and we'll get the girl checked over at urgent care. I'll also have a deputy sweep the hospital grounds. Got a feeling we're not the only ones who've been out here tonight." Mark didn't need to ask who he meant. He just glanced down at Sophie, who was still clinging to him, and then at Max, whose ears pricked at the mention of others. "Lead the way, Sheriff," Mark said. Chapter 6. The New Home. Morning broke in Havenbrook with a pale, washed-out light, the rain finally giving way to a sky streaked with thin ribbons of gold and silver. The storm had left puddles in the streets and a clean scent of wet earth in the air. Mark Lane sat in a small, wood-paneled office at the Havenbrook Sheriff's Department, a steaming mug of black coffee between his hands. Sophie was in the waiting area with Max, curled up together on a blanket Sheriff Briggs had found in the back room. Across the desk, Detective Carla Merritt flipped through a folder of photographs and reports. Merritt was in her early 40s, with a lean build and a face that wore both determination and fatigue. Her auburn hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and the faint lines around her eyes hinted at years of long hours in cold cases. Known for her meticulous nature, she had a reputation for connecting dots others missed. "We got him," Merritt said, sliding a photo across the desk. Earl Denton's mugshot stared back, eyes hooded, expression sour. He didn't get far. Deputy Weller picked him up 2 blocks from Oak Ridge, limping and dripping wet. We searched his stash in the basement. Medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, even old surgical tools, half of it traced back to clinics and warehouses in 3 counties. Mark's jaw tightened. "So he's part of something bigger?" Merritt nodded. "Looks like a theft ring specializing in abandoned medical stock. They strip out anything that can be resold, no matter how expired. We've been chasing ghosts for months. Now we have a face and a link to the others." Sheriff Briggs stepped into the office, shaking off his raincoat. "He'll be looking at serious time, and I suspect some of his friends will start talking when they realize he's in custody." Briggs glanced toward the waiting area where Sophie giggled softly as Max nudged her with his nose. "Your girl's tougher than most grown men I've met, and that dog, well, he's something else." 2 days later, Mark stood before a review board at Fort Ralston. The hearing was brief. His request for early honorable discharge had been under consideration ever since Captain Holloway filed the paperwork Sergio had sent through. Now, with the official documentation of Sophie's endangerment and the sheriff's statement, the decision was unanimous. Mark Lane was released from active duty, his years of service closing not with ceremony, but with a firm handshake and a nod of respect from his commanding officer. He drove back to Havenbrook the next morning, a rented moving truck trailing behind his Jeep. Sophie was waiting outside Martha Keene's house when he pulled up, her hair loose and gleaming in the sunlight. Max bounded down the steps ahead of her, tail high, barking once in recognition. That evening, after unloading the last box into their new home, a modest 2-story with a wraparound porch on the edge of town, Mark found himself in the small study, sorting through military files and personal keepsakes. He came across a sealed envelope marked K9 Deployment Records. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a faded roster from his Afghanistan tour, listing the service dogs that had worked alongside his unit. One name stopped him cold. Max, K9, handler, Sergeant P. Westbrook. The attached photo showed a younger Max, sleek, sharp-eyed, his coat glossier but unmistakable. The report detailed an operation near Jalalabad where Max had located an IED moments before detonation, saving the lives of 3 soldiers, Mark among them. He sank into the desk chair, staring at the page. "It was you," he murmured. The memory came rushing back, dust in the air, adrenaline pounding, and the sudden bark that had frozen him in place just before the device was found. Later, on the porch, he watched Sophie toss a ball into the yard, Max racing after it with the same determination he'd shown in a war zone. Sophie's laughter rang out, bright and unburdened. She caught the ball from Max's mouth and pressed a kiss to his head. "Best dog in the whole world," she declared. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in amber and rose. The air was still damp from the storm 2 nights before, but it carried the warmth of renewal. Mark leaned against the porch railing, taking in the sight of his daughter and the dog who had saved them both, once on a battlefield, and again here in Havenbrook. For the first time in a long while, there was no urgency tugging at him, no orders waiting to be followed. Just the sound of Sophie's laughter, the thump of Max's paws on the grass, and the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to protect the ones we love. This story is a reminder that loyalty, courage, and the bond between family and faithful friends can guide us through the darkest storms. In our everyday lives, we all face challenges that test our strength and our faith. But like Mark, Sophie, and Max, we can come through them stronger and closer than before. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and if you believe in the power of love, protection, and second chances, type Amen in the comments. Remember to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of faith and courage. May God bless you and protect you and your loved ones always.